So happy to be back. I come back every year, and it's always very exciting to see all the emerging writers, new writers, debut authors, and established authors. We have some very distinguished authors today. So I'm just going to introduce them by name briefly, and then when they give their readings, I'll give you a more detailed biography. So in alphabetical order, Simon Johnson, first seat here, David Mira in the middle, Emi Sasagawa, right there, Candy Tanaka, and Jack Wang. So the order of reading will be the order I introduced you in, just to give you a heads up. Okay, so let's talk about Simon. Simon's novel, House of Daughters, was released in December 2022. House of Wives, published by Penguin Random House, was a Globe and Mail bestseller in 2016. So this is a sequel. His short stories have appeared in Rice Paper and other magazines. Simon was born and raised in Hong Kong and educated in Canada at McMaster University, class of 72. He has worked extensively in Canada as an artistic director, and playwright, and most recently as the artistic and executive director of Richmond's Gateway Theatre from 1999 to 2012. His latest play, El Camino, will be featured in June at Peninsula Productions in White Rock. Simon lives in South Surrey with his wife, Sheila, lovely wife, and their sybaritic cat, Dash. His website is www.simonjohnson.ca.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for being here and celebrating with me. And I'd like to acknowledge Alan and the work that the festival has done in the last few years and continues to do today. It's really very special and very important to have this festival, particularly for voices from people like myself. I want to explore a little bit in lieu of a reading, just explore a little bit about the concept of having a literary home and having a literary family. These are really important aspects for me as a writer, and I think for many other writers as well, and everybody else that I have talked to about this subject. When this came out in 2017, I think it was, one of the things that I was advised to do, I won't say by whom, was to introduce the Chinese part of my heritage. I've always been known as Simon Johnston as a playwright and as a director and as a theater director, but somehow or other it wasn't enough. And it was suggested to me that I include my mother's name as part of my family name. So therefore it is Simon Choa Johnston, or in Chinese, Choi. It was very interesting. Around the same time, there were some grants available for some of the work that I was doing, and I had telephoned the officer to find out some details and whether I would qualify. And the response to me was, "You're not Asian enough." And very interestingly, as the conversation matured, the officer said, "Maybe you're too Asian. So either I'm not Asian enough, or I am too Asian because of the stuff that I write about." Anyway, I bring that out just as an example of some of the lived experiences of my life as a writer, and to say that there's a long way to go. And what I have found always in the LiterASIAN Festival and amongst my colleagues is a welcoming I found a family and I found a home, and I rejoice in that. The second book, which is a standalone book called House of Daughters, came out in December of 22, and I wanted to let you all know that those initial reactions that I had about myself and my heritage had disappeared suddenly. Suddenly it had disappeared. How and why, I don't know. Perhaps it's because of all the work that has, I would like to think it's because of the work and the presence of the diaspora and the voices of the diaspora in poetry and in literature, in films, and also in novels and in historical novels especially. So I'm feeling really good about that. I'm feeling that this is progress. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I came to these two books. It started when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I used to ask my mother about my ancestors, and she would reply, "Ask me when you're older." And so I waited a year or two, or maybe 6 months, and I asked again. And it felt like she had a secret to share, but she didn't want to tell me about. So of course I pestered her even more, and finally she looked at me very sternly and she said, "Your great-grandfather was Emmanuel Belilius, a Jewish opium merchant from Kolkata." Now, we were living in Hong Kong at the time, and all my friends and my family were Asian or part Asian or Eurasian as I am. And she told me this otherworld story. It was a gigantic surprise, and I couldn't, my brain couldn't accept this third component, because it appeared that I was also Jewish. So here I am, struggling as a kid, being part Chinese, part British, Scottish, and now I added being a Sephardic Jew to the whole equation. So I pushed my mum a little bit further, and if great-grandfather was Emmanuel, then who was my great-grandmother? And eventually, after a few feints, she sighed, looked around to see if anyone was looking or listening, and then she leaned in and whispered, "Emmanuel was already married in Kolkata to a woman named Seema. She was the senior wife. When he came to Hong Kong, he fell in love with a local Chinese woman whose name was Pearl, in Cantonese, Bo Chu. She was your great-grandmother, and some say a Jewish convert." I was stunned into silence, and my young mind again struggled to visualize these different dichotomies. I ran to my bed, I remember that. I fished out my notebook from my school bag and I wrote down what I had just heard. It was difficult enough being Eurasian, a half-breed, a mutt, as some people have called me. But now I had to add an extra layer of otherness. I was also Jewish, but we were Roman Catholic. How did that deal? And then there was that opium thing. It was all way too much. And so I slammed my notebook shut. I didn't look at it for 40-odd years. And it was 1997, and my family had settled in Vancouver, and my mother moved into a senior's residence. And having downsized, she gave me several boxes of her papers, and among them was my childhood notebook. And these notes I kept, seized my imagination from that point, and kindled the little flame of curiosity that soon became an obsession. I decided to start writing about it, and when I had finished writing about it, I realized that I knew all the facts in terms of baptisms, marriages, deaths, and some social activities that were recorded in newspapers, but I didn't know anything about who the people were, and that's why it's a book of fiction, because I imagined what happened behind closed doors. What happened outside the door was fine, everybody knew about, but what happened in inside and behind closed doors is the subject of exploration in these two books. So in House of Wives asks the question, how does a Jewish opium merchant from Kolkata make a home for himself and his two wives, the senior wife and the junior wife, in 19th century Hong Kong? And that became House of Wives. But there was a lot more material that I discovered, and the question became, how does Pearl preserve that home for the next generation and the generations to come? And looking for the answers of those gave me House of Daughters. The theme began to emerge. My work, all the work that I have, even my stage plays, Running Dog, Paper Tiger, Gold Mountain Guests, Rice Rockets, and Yacht People, has as a common theme, they were all about home. Not a house, but a home. A place that allows a sense of belonging, a safe place where I can live with a family that will uphold their legacy and where the next generation can thrive. So I thank you all, my colleagues, my family, for constructing this very real sense of home and for giving me an opportunity to occupy a space in my own home. I rejoice to say that may every year be like today and every age be like the dawn. Ni ni yao kam yat, soi soi yao kam chiu. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next author is David Mura. David's most recent book is acclaimed The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths and Our American Narratives. His previous book was on creative writing and race, A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing. With essayist Carolyn Holbrook, David is co-author of an anthology of 2021 Minnesota BIPOC writers. We Are Meant to Rise, Voices for Justice from Minneapolis to the World. You better get comfortable. This is a really long bio because he's had such a distinguished career.
That's enough.
That's enough? Okay. There's more. There's way more. He's very talented.
Hi, I am here because I'm staying at the Joy Kagawa House, and I want to thank Anne-Marie Metten and the Kagawa House for housing me for this May for a wonderful residency. And I reread Obasan, Joy Kagawa's Obasan today on, this week, as sitting at the desk where she wrote it. So there was something very wonderful and poetic about that. I'm a third generation Japanese American. My grandfather came here in 1898. Both my parents were imprisoned by the US government during World War II, and the Japanese American internment paralleled or echoed many of the things that happened to Japanese Canadians. So this is a short poem, and it's about a family friend who, to get a job, had to take a psychological test after he got out of the camps. It's called Internment Camp Psychology, circa 1945. Just after his release, Moss took a psychological test. 3 questions he never forgot. Do you think people are out to get you? Do you feel you are being followed? When you see a crowd of strangers walking towards you, do you try to avoid them? To all 3, he answered yes, and knew he sounded insane. I live in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis has been shaped by, as many American cities have been shaped by, the passage of the Hart-Celler Act in the early 60s, which opened up immigration to the United States to non-white countries. And in Minneapolis, we've had refugees from the war in Vietnam, from Laos, from Vietnam, from the Hmong people, and we've had wave after wave of refugees. In the 90s, we had a wave of Somali refugees, and My kids went to school with him. My son, his girlfriend is Somali. And so this is a poem about his friend Abdi, who tragically was shot outside a rec center. So there's trigger warning, there's violence in this poem. And Abdi and my son Nico were working on a hip hop album together. After Abdi died, my son sort of slipped out my wife's credit card and used it to help pay. Abdi's mother was staying in Mogadishu because his father was in Mogadishu and was dying. And so she had to come back. And so my son used my wife's credit card to help pay her back. And the Somali community, like many communities, immigrant communities, makes the distinction between those inside the community outside. So Abdi's mother was one of the few mothers who accepted my son Nico. So that's also in this poem. So Abdi was shot outside a rec center, just a mile from my house. Poem for Abdi. 10:35. Gnats and mosquitoes blurring streetlights in the parking lot of the Coil Rec Center. And Abdi's smoking, chilling just after the lights slipped away on this near solstice. And the lines he's on fleek flow through that girl he passed at the Mall of America. The apartment he'll go back to without his mother, returned to Mogadishu to aid his dying poet father, heart failing without metaphor. And Abdi thinks, tomorrow I'll be breaking Ramadan. As the beats my son Nico laid down for him start to jump, my brain ain't neurological, beyond ecological. I've torched the devil's follicles, stroking his blood-red tail, thinking where he failed and where a bullet sails, lurking late for Ismail. 3 shots, pop, pop, pop. Here's only the first. Behind him in his head, his lines, that girl, Ismail, his mother, the fast off Ramadan, all explode from his skull into the June night as he topples. And suddenly there's 2 black brothers over him, smashing at his chest, and he's not even thinking, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And the streetlight above burns fluorescence into his retina, gnats, mosquitoes, a strange yellow glow before the red, the red. The red, the red. And he'll never witness his brother, his sister Jamila, his friends Baden and Khadijah, and my son Nico hunkered in the waiting room as the surgeons huddle 2 hours to undo what can't be undone. 3 days later, Nico stands with Abdi's friends and family. The mother just returned from Somalia, his father still dying, unable to fly. And there is no coffin to cover his sleeping face. As he's lowered 2 graves from Baden's brother, and my son grips his shaking girlfriend, and as he looks at Abdi's mother, the only Somali mother who ever accepted him, even loved him, he thinks of the track Abdi and he jammed on, the album they'd planned, and how just hours earlier at work when he told his boss of his son's death, his boss shot back, well, that's what you get for hanging around with those people. And how did they get to be my son's people? How am I to comfort my son, weeping before me now in my study, or chastise him for using my wife's credit card to help buy the mother's plane fare and a bus ticket for another friend to leave for Fargo so he doesn't become one more Abdi? My son Nico's saying he looked at the mother's face, falling into her son in the grave. They wanted to rip the clouds from the sky, rip his boss's hair from their follicles, cut the tracks of their album that will never be finished, and the kids in school shouting at Abdi, "Look at me, I'm the captain," and "Hey, Mohammed's suicide bomber." And my son's saying, "I can't believe he's dead, Dad. I can't take it in." And I'm holding him as Abdi will never be held by his mother, his father, the poet, dying in Mogadishu. And I can't say I hate this world as much as you, Nico, though that too is in my heart. And so I say, Abdi's life was not his death. Your friendship was not his death. His music was not his death. And so I say, listen, he's still rapping. Those lines are still there. He's still talking to you. What is he saying? And Nico, as his body shakes in my arms, he'd want me. He'd want me to be happy. And I see Abdi's face standing beside us. And I tell him, "Thank you, Abdi. Thank you for loving my boy." Thank you.
Wow, that was very powerful. Can you do the rap again? I really enjoyed that. Okay, next up is Emi Sasagawa, is a settler, immigrant, and queer woman of color living and writing on the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Her debut novel, Atom Weight, published by Tidewater Press, explores identity and belonging through the lenses of mixedness, queerness, oppression, and privilege, inviting reflection on the space we take up in the world and the purpose of our existence. Emi is a graduate of the Writers Studio at Simon Fraser University and is currently completing an MFA in creative writing at the University of British Columbia. Please welcome Emi Sasagawa.
It's a great honor to be surrounded by so many established authors. My book has just come out this week, so it's... Thank you. This is all quite new to me, so hopefully I don't stumble. And today I'll be reading from Atom Weight. I've chosen today one of the more tender passages that happen later in the book when the protagonist, Aki, and her parents and brother visit the Sunshine Coast with their extended family on a retreat. For our last night, Mom planned a 3-course meal for the whole family. To start, an arugula salad with walnuts, goat's cheese, and honey. For the main course, spaghetti alla vongole, because clams were my grandparents' favorites. And for dessert, flan, which she made with condensed milk, just as her grandmother had done. Dinner went smoothly. On the one end of the table, my grandfather spoke loudly with his sons and son-in-law, gesturing profusely and reminiscing about a fishing trip they'd taken somewhere east when my dad was only 8. At the other end, Mom and Aunt Emiko exchanged cake recipes, while my Aunt Yuki quietly nodded. My brother Haru and my cousins, in an attempt to be useful, stoked the fireplace. They even tried to include Masashi, our younger cousin, who awkwardly tossed logs from a distance. The only ones who remained silent and mostly unengaged was my grandmother, arched over her food next to my dad. After dinner, Oji-chan invited my dad and uncle for a whiskey on the deck, while my mom and aunts washed dishes in the kitchen. All in our own way, we pretended for one last time that the past 2 weeks had been sublime. It was a way of reassuring each other we'd show up at the same cabin 2 years from now. My grandmother was still seated at the now empty table. She seemed to be chewing on something, her eyes half open. Would she be with us 2 years? 2 years from now. The conversation on the ferry rushed back into my head. Don't bring it up with people, just for now, my mom had said. Nah was all I might have with Obachang. I walked over to the table and sat next to her. Then I took a big breath and leaned in. I'm gay, I whispered softly in her ear. She continued to chew, eyes staring blankly ahead. I tried it again, this time a little louder. I like women. Obachan slowly tilted her head and turned toward me, her whole body shaking slightly. For a second or two, I believed she might have understood what I said, but she uttered not a word, her expression still immutable. I smiled softly and bowed instinctively, not quite knowing what my gestures were communicating. Obachan closed her eyes slowly and smiled back. Then she returned to her initial posture, shoulders arched forward, neck bent down, staring at the edge of the table. Thank you.
Candy Tanaka, you are next. Candy is a multiracial trans writer, artist, and librarian challenging the binaries continually reconstructed between self and other while exploring archive and memory in a socio-political context. They are a creative writing graduate of the Writers Studio program at Simon Fraser University and have a BFA in Intermedia from Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design. Their first YA book, Baby Drag Queen, was published with Orca Books in April 2023. They've also published work in Resonance, Essays on the Crafts of Life and Writing with Anvil Press, and This Will Only Take a Minute, Canadian Flash Fiction with Garnica Editions. Thank you, Candy. Please read for us.
Again, I'm honored to be on this panel as well with all these great writers. This is my first YA book. Writing YA is actually kind of interesting and very, very different. There's a certain writing level that you have to write to, and I had to revise it many times because usually I write for adults. So it was a really interesting process to go through, but I'm not going to read from Baby Drag Queen today because I feel like this is not really a YA audience. So I'm going to read a couple short flash fiction pieces that are in this anthology called This Will Only Take a Minute with Guernica. And here we go. So the first one is called Risotto Interrupted. It was your birthday, so you invited her and your friends over to celebrate. It was just you and her in the kitchen. You were cooking mushroom risotto, and as anyone who has ever cooked mushroom risotto knows, it's a delicate process requiring concentration and precise timing. You distractedly talked small talk, then she mentioned her move away into a 1920s apartment, which sounded like a lot like had a similar layout to yours, except it's a one-bedroom and not a studio. Then you did that terrible thing that you never do, but you couldn't control yourself, and you said with intensity, "You know, I'm really going to miss you." And then you know that piece by John Cage that's called 4 minutes, 33 seconds? This could have been called 8 minutes, 66 seconds, because that's how long the silence lasted. As a friend, couldn't she have said even something like, I'll miss you too, or you should come and visit? Instead, she said, but I'm really looking forward to it. With your clumsy recovery skills, you chimed in, but it will be really good for you to go back to school. You never said that to anyone before. She probably couldn't really care less what you think, but still there was something hanging in the air between the two of you that seemed like an intense tenderness. You know she felt it too because she wouldn't move from the kitchen. You wanted her to leave, but you felt like a big-ass fool. Why won't she leave, you thought? Usually she's off dashing somewhere where she's checking her phone for texts from one of the loser guys that she's dating. I can't cook this risotto properly. It's fucking starting to stick to the bottom of the pot, you think, frantically stirring while the liquid reduces itself. Just then you hear someone yelling your name outside your second-floor kitchen window from the side of the building. God, don't these people know that they have these things now called buzzers for apartment buildings? Today, at the most inappropriate time ever, your friends are yelling at you to say that they are here. So you need help. The risotto needs to be watched because it's at a critical stage and neither you nor her want to leave the kitchen. You ask your wacky friend in the other room, entertaining her friend, if she could please let S and her boyfriend in. There's no response. Can someone please go downstairs and let them in? I'm cooking the risotto and I can't leave. Finally, she says she will go. Thank God, you think, but at the same time, you don't want her to leave the kitchen. By the time everyone is back, Upstairs, your friends come to greet you in the kitchen. You have recovered slightly, but want them to leave so that the hot girl will come back and just stand near you. You see her motion to, but she stops at the entrance because the kitchen is now horribly full. And then I'll just read another short one. I think it should be within my time. This one's called Drama Class. So Act 1. In elementary school, I was quite brazen. The first play I ever auditioned for was a Charlie Brown Christmas. I wanted the lead, but I ended up with the part of Lucy. They told me it was because my hair was black, like Lucy's, and Sarah Porter's was blonde. Those damn blondes. This other girl, Tracy, was going to play Snoopy because her mom made this amazingly realistic costume with a whole separate dog head and body piece. I didn't want to wear a dress. Instead, I insisted upon a purple pantsuit, a much better choice back then. Behind the psychiatric booth, I offered help for 5 cents. I was thrilled to be holding a mic. Nowadays, it seems like I'm oftentimes behind that booth again, listening to my friends' problems and offering helpful advice. The part that really stressed me out, though, was the scene where Snoopy dog kisses Lucy. The famous bit where she screams, "Ugh, I've been kissed by a dog. I have dog germs. Get hot water. Get some disinfectant. Get some iodine." Was I going to be kissed by a girl? Because this would be my first kiss then. The costume saved me, though, because the dog nose was so big that's all that ended up touching my cheek. I can't even remember the name of the girl that kissed me. Later on in life, I realized that I should always remember the name of the girl that kisses me. Act 2. I performed as a magician on stage because I had gone on a road trip to Portland with my parents and had enough money saved for a small magic kit. It included a top hat, magic wand, card tricks, ball and vase, metal linking rings, magic cups with balls, and yellow sponge bunnies that I made disappear and reappear. I practiced for days for my performance, and it all went pretty smoothly. Intermission. I loved acting, so myself and my friend Catherine, Farmer in the Dell, I gave her that nickname. We would use our lunch hours to write plays so that they would be performed on stage during school assemblies. We were both encouraged by our drama teacher to put these on. Closing scene. I don't know exactly how this happened, but one year I was Santa Claus. I wore my red and white striped Adidas tracksuit, a white elastic dirty gray beard, and some black lace boots. It was like a 1970s version of Bad Santa. The highlight for me, though, was when my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Goodhart, surprised everyone and came and sat on my knee. Copious amounts of laughter and shrieking ensued. Ah, Mrs. Goodhart. She would get into trouble nowadays doing something like that. But the little boy in me loved it, and it ruined me for life. Thanks.
Thank you, Candy. That was fabulous. Okay. Last but not least, we have Jack Wang. Jack is the author of We Two Alone, longlisted for Canada Reads 2022 and winner of the 2021 Central New York Book Award in Fiction and the 2020 Danuta Gleed Literary Award from the Writers Union of Canada for Best Debut Collection in English. His fiction has been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize and longlisted for the Journey Prize. He has received funding from the Canada Council for the Arts and the New York Foundation for the Arts and held the 2014-15 David T.K. Wong Creative Writing Fellowship at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. He teaches writing at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks as well to Alan and Wiley and Sophie and everyone else involved in putting together this festival. Thanks to all of you for being here, and I'm super grateful to be on this panel with fellow authors. The Canadian edition of this book came out in 2020. We all know what happened in 2020, and I've done many events, including literary festivals, all on Zoom from my bedroom. This is actually the first event that I've done with fellow authors, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to do the opposite of Simon. I'm going to make remarks along the lines of what you did today to just talk a little bit tomorrow at the other event. Today I'm just going to read a bit of my fiction. So I'm going to read from the title story of We Two Alone. We Two Alone is a collection of 6 short stories and a novella. And We Two Alone is the novella. So I'm just going to read from the very beginning. And yeah, We Two Alone. At the start of the final scene, in the middle of his speech to Cordelia, Leonard's mind went blank. One moment his mind was full and the next it was empty, like a lake instantly drained, and the feeling was eerie. He scoured his memory, expecting words to leap to his tongue, to rush back in, but none came. Suddenly the stage lights prickled, and his costume weighed like a lead apron. Leonard Shao had waited a decade to play Lear. As the founder, director, and lead actor of the Asian American Shakespeare Company, he alone decided what got put on every year. At a hale-looking 48, he was still too young for the role, but this was the company's 10th year, which called for a play with commemorative heft. Leonard had always been known for his memory. Just last year, playing Henry V, he'd been flawless, even in rehearsal. Famously, he never needed scripts for table work, just recited entire plays by heart. But this year was different. At the table read, he found himself stumbling, using the prompt book. In rehearsal, he snapped impatiently for cues. He and Emily had separated after 20 years, and the strain was taking its toll. He thought Lear would finally bring her out of obscurity, but she hadn't shown up for last night's opening, and he hadn't seen her tonight either. His mind was addled. But he feared it wasn't that, or not just that. Before she died, his mother had lost her memory. What had surprised him about her decline was not the forgetting, so much as the darkening of her mood, the sudden, improbable fits of rage. Once when his parents were in town, he took them to a Japanese restaurant, a little hole in the wall in the Bowery. After he asked for a table, his mother decided she wanted to go somewhere else. When he said they ought to stay, the waitress had already set down menus. His mother began to yell, to hurl insults, until he and his father had no choice but to whisk her out. Now that same darkness was seeping into him. The first time they rehearsed the final act of Lear, the young man who played the captain, whose small but vital role was to show a range of feeling as Edmund orders Lear and Cordelia to be executed. The young man had put on such a ridiculous pantomime that Leonard had lost it. Who are you? Marcel fucking Marceau? The young man had cowered in shame, the outburst so unlikely that Leonard had surprised even himself. When all this evidence began to mount, all he wanted was to make it through the run without going up on a line. When he made it through opening night, he was buoyed. And until a moment ago, a second clean performance had seemed within reach. But now he was looking at Sophie Hsu, Cordelia, baffled as to what came next. They were holding hands, and he felt a clasp of assurance, even as her eyes quickened from worry to pity to panic. As he turned to the shrouded darkness of the house, a tiny rental on West 45th Street, he had time to think that her stricken looks could be read as Cordelia's, and his own befuddled ones as Lear's. He kept rooting around for the rest of the line, patting the high shelf in his mind where he swore he had left it. Nothing. Just as silence threatened to unnerve the audience, Edmund stepped forward and said, "Take them away." And everything else came rushing back. Thank you.
So this ends the reading part of the program, and we open up for questions. But I'm going to selfishly ask some first myself, then I'll turn it over to you guys to ask whatever's on your mind. So while you're formulating your questions, I will ask each of the authors to answer this question. So I know some of the audience have, there are aspiring authors in the audience, so I asked this question on their behalf. I'm always interested to see how people get published. So I'm going to ask each of the authors to respond to this question. What was the journey that led to the publication of your first book? And has being an Asian writer helped or hindered your publication journey, and how?
It seems less scary when I volunteer. So my answer might sound a little bit like a promotion for the writer studio at SFU, because the idea for this book emerged in that workshop. At the time, I was being mentored by JJ Lee, and he helped me sort of pick of all of the ideas and experiences that I had, which one had felt like it would have the biggest impact as a literary work. I continued to work on it through the graduate program at SFU, and then did quite a bit of writing on my own. I was really lucky through my relationship with JJ that 2.5 years after writing, well, actually 2 years after writing it, I had a full manuscript. I gave it to him, and he thought it was good enough to share with other people, and so he shared it with the publishing house that actually approached me. So I never really had the experience of going out and asking folks to read my work, and I understand that that's a very privileged position to be in. Tidewater approached me in 2020, and at the time I felt like I wasn't emotionally ready to tell the story, so I asked them to wait. They came back in 2021, I asked them to wait, and they were incredibly patient with me and my story, and last year when they finally asked again, I felt like I was ready. So I worked with them for a year. They're a small publishing house based out of New Westminster, and I really wanted that experience, it being my first novel, of working with an editor very closely and having sort of hands-on feedback. In terms of my Asian identity and whether that helped or hindered, I don't know. I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I identify as many things, and I think my identity lies at the intersection of being Asian, but also being Latina, being a woman, being somebody who presents as gender nonconforming, also somebody who's queer, and so I can't exactly parse out what has influenced the publication of this book, and I think it's in part that desire to tell a story that's fuller and that doesn't compartmentalize one's identity, whether they're Asian or not, they're, you know, a woman or a man or somebody who's non-binary, and actually writing about the experience as a whole and as an authentic way as I possibly could. That being said, I find it super interesting how I'm often described as a person who is Asian Canadian. I am part Asian. I am technically not Canadian. So I want to make sure that I put that out there so as to, I'm not trying to conceal that in any way. I don't have a Canadian passport. I'm a permanent resident. But I felt such overwhelming warmth and welcome from the Asian Canadian community. And I feel such gratitude to be included in this group, and in some ways being Asian Canadian is, I like to say, equal parts imaginary and possibility for me, and I occupied that space with a lot of pride and care.
So that begs the question, what is your passport? What's your citizenship?
I'm Japanese and Brazilian.
Oh, interesting. Okay, anybody else want to answer this question? Okay, David Mira.
You asked us about, what you said, the first book? I'm going to talk about the last book. My book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths in Our American Narratives. And I live in the Twin Cities, not more than maybe 3.5 miles from where George Floyd was murdered. But 4 or 5 years before that, another African-American man was shot on a road by a policeman, probably not more than 2 miles from my house. And I started writing about his murder, in part because it was so close and I knew people who knew him. And I began to realize that I could not really understand what happened on Larpenteur Road in a near suburb of St. Paul without going into American history, and without examining how the category of whiteness and blackness were created in American history, and how they led to the murder of Philando Castile, who had been stopped officially more than 50 times in 10 years by the police. And his mother said it was more like 80 times. Now, I mention this because this book, I sent it to an earlier draft to, and this is for emerging writers, I sent it to the press that had published my novel, and they rejected it. And the editor said, well, we're looking for more experimental essays. So I sent it to another press, Grey Wolf, and the editor was interested in it, but she rejected it. But she met with me a couple times, and we talked about the book, and she was very generous about it. So this book was only accepted on the third try at the University of Minnesota Press. But I'm teaching 4 classes this month at the Joy Kagawa House, and one of the things I said is that writing, you have to look at it as a process and not the production of a product, and that all you can do is engage in the process of a book. And I have this book, A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing, and part of it is about race and the issues of creative writing. But I also say that we start a book in order to become the person who finishes the book. So when you start a book, you're not the author who's going to finish the book. And you don't determine the journey. And in The Stranger's Journey, I talk a lot about the 3-act structure. And in the middle of the second act, there's always this what Campbell calls being in the belly of the beast, this dark night of the soul, this sense of failure. And I think that any writer who's really writing a book which challenges them comes to this point in the middle where either it's rejected over and over again, and somehow you have to rethink the book, or write more, rewrite more, and rewrite more. And you may think, oh God, this is never going to get published, right? And you just have to have the faith to continue on with that work. And as for being Asian, I do know that this book, because it's mainly about the way that white America tends to tell its history and create its fictional narratives, and contrasting that with the history, the consciousness, the experiences, and the narratives of African Americans, which in many ways are either marginalized or cut out of America's sense of its own history, that this book would have a wider, sort of more immediate audience than my books about being Asian American. And that's just, but the other thing is, as an Asian American writing about the black-white race relations, I come from an odd place, right? Because I'm neither black nor white. And it allows me a unique perspective. And I think one of the things about being Asian American is, first, that you always understand you in many ways are a perpetual alien. Like if something happens in the next few years between China and America, all East Asians in America will suddenly be looked at as aliens and foreigners, as happened during the pandemic. There was a 150% rise in anti-Asian hate crimes in the States as a result of the pandemic. And so even though my grandfather came here in 1898 and my family's been here for a century and a quarter, I don't feel like the rest of America looks at me like an American. all right? But the advantage of that is I never think that my own story is central. And what it means that is like, I understand I have to look at everybody else's story and understand my story in relationship to everybody else's story. And there's a blindness that comes sometimes when you feel that you're part of the majority, when you, men feel this, right? Men exhibit this sort of blindness, right? Because we're supposed to have power, and then power blinds you. But if you're on the margins, there are things that you see that other people don't see. And to me, that's the advantage of being an Asian American author, is that I see things and I can travel between groups. And I had a freedom as I became an adult to get to know African American writers, get to know the African American community. And I understood that that was an essential part of my education as an American and as a writer, and the result is this book. Thank you.
Thank you. Profound words. Jack or Simon or Candy, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think after you've got a manuscript that you're fairly happy with, the next step is to get a good editor. I can't tell you how valuable that is, even before you send it to a publisher. And then if you're fortunate enough to have publishers that took up my book, they will assist again with more editing. So as David says, it never ends. It's a process. And eventually, after submitting it to people, I think finding an agent is also very, very helpful. And the agents are less scary than they are often made out to be. So I think getting a manuscript in the best way possible, the best version of your story possible, hiring and working closely with an editor, a substantive editor, or even a line editor, but substantive editor first, then redoing it, and then finding an agent, and hopefully the agent will place your book. So I think that's, for me, that was the journey, that was the process. It's also one of the reasons why I don't like doing readings from my own book, because every time I've done a reading from my book, I think, my God, what, really? You wrote that? Come on, we can do better. And so it bothers me a little bit. It's something that is encased. It's a time capsule. It's a little time capsule. This represents who I was, as you say, when I wrote that, and when I was happy with that, and when I thought, wow, this is going to win the Nobel Prize. Now I would have done it differently. I would approach it differently. So do the best you can with the help that is out there.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, so I actually decided that tomorrow, at tomorrow's event, I was going to give a brief history in 4 minutes of my life as a writer. So that kind of overlaps with your questions. So I'm going to sort of try to thread the needle a little bit. So when I started writing these stories, I think it was around 2010, I had put 2 novels in a drawer and spent, a long time on those 2 novels that I put in a drawer. So I was almost 40 years old. It's part of what I'm going to say tomorrow. I was almost 40 years old and basically back to square one. And so I went back to writing short stories because I just wanted to finish something quickly and get it out in the world. That first short story was rejected when I sent it out to literary journals probably 30 times before somebody took it. But then, with each successive story, things got easier and easier. And in my second novel, I found an agent, the second novel that I ultimately put in a drawer, I did have an agent for it, and it did make the rounds. But my experience finding an agent with a work that perhaps wasn't quite ready was quite difficult. Lots of waiting, lots of silence, and lots of rejection, even though ultimately I found one. But when I worked on these stories and slowly built my bona fides as a writer, be it the Journey Prize or the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, or getting the fellowship in England, over the course of almost 10 years, my experience finding an agent for the collection was quite different. I sent it to my agent, Jackie Kaiser, at Westwood Creative Artists, and I got a response the same day. And what I tell my students is, here, I can show you how to write a query letter. It's a formula. I can show you in basically 2 minutes. This is how you write a query. But the bio, where you're establishing your bona fides as a writer, that takes a long time, or at least it did for me. And that's the part you can't really fake, right? That took a lot of time. And even when you find an agent, there's obstacles, setbacks at every part of the process, or there can be, as David was suggesting with his book. So for example, my agent, the first time she went out to American publishers, actually nobody in the US was interested in my collection. And this goes a little bit to the question of, is being Asian, a helpful thing or not? Because on the one hand, I think there is a genuine interest in publishing more diverse stories. Whether that levels the playing field is up for debate, but I think there is a genuine interest. There are complicated questions about, who you imagine the audience to be for these stories, right? Who are these stories written for, published for? Those are their complexities to that question, but I think there is an interest. At the same time, many houses have this notion that it's kind of a zero-sum game, and there are only so many writers of color that they're going to publish. So, for example, there was an article that appeared in the New York Times. The title was "Just How White is the Publishing Industry," and they talked about how some houses, they would get in a very interesting manuscript, and then their attitude, but we have a black author, for example. We have a black author. And I actually experienced something similar when one of the objections was, well, we just published, and I could infer that it was The Fortunes by Peter Ho Davies. We just published a Chinese-American author, very similar. And, to my mind, by similar, yes, it's about Chinese experience in the 20th century. But beyond that, not that similar, But basically, the sense was, well, we got our Chinese author, and we don't need to publish another one. So sometimes there is this feeling that there are a fixed number of slots, perhaps. So it can work for and against you. But speaking of having a very fine editor, or good editor, I had an excellent editor at House of Anansi. I ultimately was accepted by a Canadian publisher, and I sold world rights to House of Anansi, which means that they own all the rights, world rights in English, and then they can try to sell to other territories. And my Canadian editor, Janie Yoon, who's now at Simon & Schuster, Canada, originally my manuscript was 5 stories and a novella, and these are stories that are arranged in chronological order. They take place on many continents, and basically there was a large temporal gap in the collection. I had a story called The Night of Broken Glass, set in 1938, and then the next story in the collection was set in Oxford in England in the 80s. And she gave me a task. She said, I want you to add a story to the collection. It has to be set in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. I don't care what it's about. Aside from the fact that it be about the Chinese diaspora, just write a story set in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to fill that temporal gap in the chronology of the collection. And ultimately, at that point it became very strategic. If I'm going to add a story, why not venture to more continents, right? Why not, right, even try to bring in more of the Chinese diaspora? So I wrote about the Chinese in South Africa. And also had them ultimately leave apartheid South Africa for Australia. So that was 2 more continents. 5 continents sounds more impressive than 3, right? So just you get started to get, but you know, the reason I started writing about South Africa was because I'd read about a fishing pier where the whites were allowed to use the farthest end, where the fishing was best, and the blacks were only allowed to use the end closest to shore, where the fishing was worst, of course. And this particular fishing pier, the Chinese were allowed to use the middle of the fishing pier. And to me, this seemed like a perfect metaphor for the liminal space that Asians often occupy in a racialized society. And so this became the sort of impetus for the story. But once I added that story to the collection, House of Anansi went to the US again, and suddenly the response was different now that the collection had one more story. And I had meetings with multiple editors and ultimately settled on Harper via an imprint of HarperCollins. But, you know, as I will, you know, talk a little bit more about tomorrow, the journey was a long one. It was a long one. And it took a lot of time and patience.
And do you want to speak, Ken?
If it's okay, I'll just say a few things here. But what's interesting about Baby Drag Queen is it came about just by happenstance. And one of the things that I always like in life is if there's opportunities for you, try and take as many of them as you can, even if it's something that's not even directly related to writing, but something that's sort of tangential. Because what happened was I got asked by Vancouver Comic Arts Festival, I believe it was, to be a moderator for a panel at the last minute. And I was like, oh, I've got to read all these, like, 5 YA novels like in 2 weeks or something, and then I've got to, like, come up with some questions. I'm thinking this is a lot of pressure for me. I haven't done this before, but it's like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to set everything else aside. So I did that panel, and one of the panelists there was a trans writer with Orca, and they had said to me after the event, we kind of followed each other on Twitter, and we were talking a little bit, and they're like, Orca's looking for some writers. Why don't you pitch them, some ideas? And I thought, I don't want to write a YA novel. Like, that was in my head. I, mostly write for adults, and I thought, writing YA, how do I even go about doing that? So I just thought, what the hell, I'll just try it. Sent them 3 pitches. I thought probably never hear from them again because I've been trying to get my main manuscript published, and that was another process that I was going through. And so they wrote me back and said, yeah, you know what, we like this, the second pitch that you did. Why don't you develop this novel? And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to take me forever. Like, why did I do this now? It's like 16,000 words, and I was basically finishing my master's at the same time in library studies. And so they're like, draft an outline for us. And I'm like, okay, here we go. And of course they picked the idea that I really didn't want to do, which sounds weird, but I was like, of course they're going to pick that one because it's probably going to be, the more popular one. So I started drafting out this novel and with Orca, and they published it, and it was such a good experience for me because, I went from basically pitch right to publication. And so, I'm so grateful to Orca for taking the chance with me to write this novel. And it's actually sort of a risky move. It's writing about drag queens, and it's for YA. And I have to say, there's been so much negative and positive feedback about this book. It's hilarious. I don't want to look too much at the negative, but I did see someone write, and I'm sure that they haven't read it. They wrote that it's the most disgusting novel ever or something. And because it was on one of CBC's top 27 YA picks for the spring, and they were like so pissed off with the CBC, they were like, we need to defund the CBC because they're promoting all this stuff. Anyways, I was like, okay, this is interesting. So that was a process. But, still getting my main manuscript published, I have to say, has really been a challenge. I started writing it when I finished the Writer's Studio. I took a break for a few years, and I started writing in 2015, and what is it now, 2023, I've sent it out to agents, to publishing houses. I did get requests for a full manuscript almost right away the first time I sent it. I got really excited, probably too excited. Nothing happened. This was with an agent. I'm like, okay, sent it out a few more times, did lots of revisions in the process, still looking for someone. But I'm still gonna keep working on it and revising it. But It is a long process. I think, like Jack was mentioning, it's like you get turned down and you've already waited 6 months, you know, whatever. Then you got to send it out again. You wait another 6 months, and it's like, by then it's like 8 years have gone by, and I'm like, oh my God, right? So like, you know, doing these other things, you know, in between is always a good thing. So, you know, publishing some flash fiction, like I think other people were saying too, it's just good to like put out short stories and get something published. So, and then also being a trans masked writer that is like of color, of multiracial, is like not something I think that publishers really look for. So it's like a huge challenge to get something published. You know, and it's, I guess it's risky for them, right? You know, they're all about selling, for instance, but I think this, you know, just doing this little thing might help a little bit, but we'll see. But yeah, I'm still looking for an agent and publisher for my main manuscript.
Yes, it's a common story, isn't it? As a writer, persistence, and don't get discouraged. I think that's the message. So are there questions from the audience that we would like to entertain? I see Todd has got his hand up. Yes. Thanks. I've been given a few questions on these cards, and I'm trying to figure out what this question is. So I'll read part of it, and then the author can maybe correct me. What is your wing for writing or liking? I'm not quite sure what there's a word in quotes that I wasn't quite. Why? Okay. So I actually had a question very similar to that. And what was the driving force that compelled you to write the book that you are showcasing at LiterASIAN? Can they answer that same question, right? Why are you writing? What is your why for writing? Anybody would have any responses to this?
I think for me, I would have exploded if I didn't write this story out and get it out of my body. And I made the mistake of telling my family that I had this story, and they pestered me until I had to write the damn thing just to shut them up. But I think the main motivation, it's a mysterious thing, storytelling. You really don't know what form it's going to take until it manifests itself, and you have to allow yourself that luxury of exploration. And when it does, I think it all comes from some kind of subconscious area that, like an inflated balloon, it keeps building and building and building until you have to find an outlet for it. So honestly, that was my experience.
I mean, ultimately I'm writing because I know I'm going to die. We all know we're going to die. And I'm trying to capture, you know, some small fragment of my consciousness and the ephemera of being a human being before that happens. I mean, ultimately that is the why. More narrowly, I'll give you an example. The story I mentioned, The Night of Broken Glass. It's about a person named He Fengsan. It's actually a fictionalized version of a real person who's the Consul General of China in Vienna, which was annexed at the time by Germany, around the time of Kristallnacht, or The Night of Broken Glass. And a kind of Chinese Schindler, if you will, who was helping to save Jewish Austrians. And I remember very clearly that I never knew about this person until my first and only trip to China, when I went to the World Exposition in Shanghai in 2010. And I was at the Israel Pavilion. At the entrance to the Israel Pavilion, there was a plaque thanking He Fengsan for his exploits during the Second World War. And I said to myself, you know, why haven't I heard this story before? And of course, it could be my own ignorance, right? But I felt like this was not a widely known story compared to, say, Schindler himself, right? This was not well known to me, and I imagine to others. And so that was part of the why for some of my stories, is the feeling that I wanted to excavate some of these underreported or underappreciated and sometimes forgotten kinds of stories that I felt needed a wider audience. And venturing to, say, South Africa, or to the Second Sino-Japanese War, or to Banff in the 1920s, and a women's hockey tournament. Some of these stories were trying to excavate, I think, things about Chinese North American experience that I felt were perhaps underappreciated in the culture.
Anybody else want to answer?
I mentioned earlier that this book, in certain ways, started with the murder of Philando Castile and events like Ferguson in Missouri, where another unarmed young black man was shot. But I've taught in my friend Alex Pate's program, which is called The Innocent Classroom. And the program is designed to train American K through 12 teachers to improve their relationships with students of color. And one of the things we do the first day is we ask the teachers, what does American society say about children of color? And sometimes we have to prod them, to be honest, but once that happens, we get things like angry, dangerous, gangbangers, unwed mothers, dropouts, stupid, illegal, ugly, alien. And we get this list of 45 to 50 things. And we say to the teachers, if you know this list, the kids know this list. And many of them think you're looking at them through this list. Now, when George Floyd was killed, there was a letter from a 7th grade teacher on the north side of Minneapolis whose class was almost entirely black. And she asked her class to write about My America. And here's what she says. Nearly 100% of my class wrote about their fear of the police and police brutality. In 7th grade words, they expressed unjust behaviors by authorities towards them. They are 12 and 13 years old. They do not need this weight on their shoulders right now. Their goal should be learning and being a kid. I sat down at my desk and sobbed, thinking of what my students go through on a daily basis while they are walking, playing, and talking while black. My students are funny, smart, worldly, wise, creative, loving, caring, generous, and independent young people. Right now, they do not feel safe. As a young white child in St. Paul, I felt the police were there to protect me. My students have never felt that. This needs to change. Just one more quotation. This is from an essay by my friend Douglas Carney, who comes from Minneapolis, and he writes here about having, at 6 years old, to tell his kids about the murder of Philando Castile, and then at 10 years old, having to tell them about the murder of George Floyd. As my wife and I explained to our 10-year-olds, who learned explicitly about a then contemporaneous application of this constant historic killing when St. Anthony police officer Geronimo Yanez murdered Philando Castile, it isn't that law enforcement is simply disinterested in protecting black people, but that U.S. cultural law dictate that our very presence is a thing they are meant to protect against. That white supremacy put me in a position to make this a reasonable conversation to have with my then 6-year-olds is a violence I will never forgive. I will go to work carrying it. I will share social space carrying it. I will form friendships carrying it, yet I will never forgive it. White America has gaslighted America of color since 1619 about the nature of our experience, what happened, and what white people have done. And at a certain point, I realized as an Asian American, I have to understand that.
Thank you. Emmy?
Sure. So I guess I never really explained in more detail what Atom Weight is about. So Atom Weight is a coming-of-age story about Aki, who is by all accounts considered a good girl, good student, and good daughter, and who's felt like she's done everything right by her demanding a multiracial family. Once she goes off to university, she's adjusting to life in London in the UK, and she begins to discover herself, her sexuality, and where she fits in the world. But as she's coping, eventually she comes across, or she is, a violent incident triggers an unexpected response in her, and she begins fighting. So the idea for me was really to explore anger and violence through a lens of queerness and mixedness and gender. So the book itself, or when I started working on the manuscript, it felt to me like a way of dealing with questions that I had about my own identity as a mixed race queer person. And I felt like, as is quite often the case with a lot of queer people, that coming out isn't necessarily a joyous thing. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of feelings that I hadn't dealt with that I kind of just pushed down and continue to live. And while my relationship with my family and friends had certainly evolved, I still felt very much tied to that person that I was when I was 18, 19. And so that was part of the impetus for writing this. The other part was, as a mixed race person, usually you're exoticized, and you constantly feel like an other, regardless of who you're surrounding yourself with. Whether that is other mixed race people, sometimes, the majority of the time actually, we consider mixed race a mix of white and something else, and that certainly wasn't my experience. And also feeling like not Asian enough, not Brazilian enough, not enough of anything. And so I wanted to explore what it meant to exist in this space, and to feel like in order to be something, you automatically had to erase a part of yourself. So really that duality of existence and experience. So that's, I guess in some ways, the why for writing this novel. It was very selfish. It was to give myself a space to explore and to answer some questions that I had about my own existence.
Yeah, I guess for Baby Drag Queen, it was definitely about writing, a trans main character that was multiracial, and every other character in the book is also multiracial, because that's what I wanted to do. And that doesn't happen, I guess, in YA novels very much, because I did see some comments saying that this is one of the sort of newer books that has a trans main character that is multiracial. So that definitely, I wanted that kind of representation, but I was unsure too, like, would people be interested in it? Would they not? So it's good that, it is getting a little bit of attention in that sense. And I think for, there's other themes in the book as well. Like there's, it's about a single mother that's struggling financially, about, young love, about, drag in a way as well. But I didn't want that to be the main focus of it. So, that's kind of with that novel. And I think with my other writing in general too, I also look to sort of represent more of the, trans sort of multiracial experience that is not really represented, in mainstream fiction or sort of, even nonfiction anywhere. So that's why I'm trying to sort of fit into some kind of space that I don't know where and when that's going to happen. So I'm just going to keep writing, because I can't wait forever for this one thing to get published. And it was interesting because I did read this thing that I'm not a huge Margaret Atwood fan, but I think she's a great writer aside from her politics. But I did read that her very first novel, she couldn't get published. So I kind of keep that in the back of my head. I think, wow, Margaret Atwood couldn't even get her very first novel published. So I thought, maybe the timing for this one that I'm writing, which actually is about a trans main character, and has some violence and it's a little bit troublesome or whatever, is just not the right time right now. So I might need to shelve it and get working on something else, because I've already been, keep doing it for like 8 years. I'm like, oh man, this novel's never going to get published. So anyways, those are sort of my reasons for writing in general. And just, I feel like I really love the revision process mostly too. If I could just I know it's painful, but maybe it's masochistic, I don't know, but if I could just quit my job and just write and revise all day, I would be okay. So there's just this inner need to do that, so.
Okay, spoken like a true writer.
My friend Garrett Hongo says, David, you're not a writer, you're a rewriter. Which is really his way of saying your first drafts are shit, but you keep working at it.
Did you want to add anything, Simon, or are you good? No. Okay. We're out of time. If you have more questions, you can ask the authors directly, and I'll hand over. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. It was just great. Yeah. I'll hand it over to Alan.